So welcome everyone, thanks for coming and spending a beautiful evening indoors for now. As Kate mentioned, I've been going to Ladakh, which is the northernmost part of India, for about 12 years now, off and on. And in various capacities, I've worked as a teacher, I've worked as doing field research there, I've worked with different local organizations, and most recently, these last several years, I've been working with a few communities on some building projects. So that's mostly what I'm going to talk about tonight. And the title of the talk is Building for Climate and Energy Resilience in the Indian Himalaya. I'm going to take some liberties with the term resilience, but to start with, we're going to keep it very literal. And what does a resilient house in this part of the world look like? And I see a few people in the audience who have heard me talk about Ladakh quite a bit. And to those people, I can only say, too bad. That's all we're going to talk about. So Ladakh, for those of you who aren't familiar with this region, is this northernmost part of India. It's west of Tibet. It's very mountainous. It's often called Little Tibet. The people there are majority Tibetan Buddhists, but there's also a sizable Shia Muslim population. And historically they've gotten along quite well. And it's a real crossroads culture. It's on an old spur of the Silk Road. So it's a place over the centuries where a lot of cultures came together. And some salient facts about this part of the world: it's very cold. The average altitude is 11,000 feet for settlements. And it's very dry. It's in the rain shadow formed by the Himalayan range. And therefore, settlements are almost always found along water courses, like this example. So it's really a small civilization of oases up on the roof of the world. So tonight, I'm really going to boil this down into three very short stories that I'm going to tell you, and maybe draw some connections between them. The first story starts on August 5th, 2010, and I was living in Randolph, Vermont, and I woke up and checked email, and there was an email in my inbox from a good friend of mine who's also spent a lot of time in this region, who lives in Berkshire, Vermont. And he said, I was just listening to NPR, and there's a story about Ladakh, and it's a very sad story. So on August 5th, there was a terrible flood. And what happened was they got about a year's worth of rain in the space of 2 hours. So a year's worth of rain here is really just a few inches. But as you can see in the background there's not a lot of vegetation, and there's just not a lot to anchor the soil. So this was a freakish event. They call it Cloudburst, and the results were a 15-foot wall of mud and debris came tearing down mountainsides all over the region, but especially in Leh, which is the main city. And this is a house near Leh, outside of Leh, in Shogumsar. And you can kind of see, I guess this was a 2-story house, but hopefully the people who were living there weren't there that night. That foundation used to have a house on it, so a lot of houses were swept clean and just disappeared with people sleeping in them. So all told, nobody knows exactly how many people died, several hundred, with hundreds more missing. And it was kind of a watershed moment. I should choose a different word, but it was a pivotal moment for Ladakhis because after that, and since I have friends who still say they'll run to the hills anytime they see clouds kind of massing, because it's just so terrifying. So one of the reasons this happened. Leh is a city where a lot of migrants come from all over the region. So as their traditional livelihoods, pastoralists, farmers, a are being undermined kind of in precise proportion to the degree to which they enter the global economy. People move to live, and they build houses in places where traditionally people knew not to build houses. So there's this sprawl happening, and the places that were hardest hit were in these flood paths, these traditional historical flood paths. And cars were, you know, thrown down the streets, and I think the debris was the source of a lot of the mayhem. So I went to Ladakh 7 months after this happened, and I met with my friend P. Namgyal, who's a builder and who I've known for a long time. And he and I toured some of the damage together. And it was a very sobering day. And he told me his story. He had actually narrowly escaped the flood. That, you know, by just on a whim, he decided to sleep at a friend's house, stay the night, and he went back to his room and it was destroyed. So he was a little shaken by that. So after we toured some of the damage, he and I were having tea, a little tea stall in some back alley in Leh, and I asked him one of my favorite questions, which drives my friends, they're crazy, but I'm always asking, what do you think life will look like here in 50 years? Because, as you can see in the background, the snows and the mountains are the only reason people can live there. So it's all snow-fed agriculture. Because they get so little rain, they're in the rain shadow. As the snows go, so go, you know, the self-sufficient agriculturalists of Ladakh and this whole region. So I asked T over tea, and said, T, what do you think? You know, we had just been talking about this, we'd just seen all this havoc. And P, you know, he's a very educated guy, and he knows about climate change, and keeps up with the news. And he took a sip of his tea, and he said, well, I think in 50 years, the people in the mountains are all going to have to move down to the plains. And then he said, I think the people near the coast, they'll have to move up because of rising seas. And then he paused to beat, and he kind of looked at me and he said, and then they'll all kill each other. I was like, whoa. and I think he was messing with me, because he had a slight smile on his face as he said it. But his next line was, for this reason I will not birth a child. Whoa. P, maybe it won't be so bad, you know. Give it some thought. But I should add that he wasn't totally consumed with despair, because he was working at the time with an organization that was helping to build model housing for displaced people from these floods. So here we are visiting one of these model homes, and it's designed to be passively solar heated, I think direct gain. So using thermal mass and appropriately sized south-facing glazing, very simple system with good insulation and reasonable air tightness. In a region where temperatures go down to 30 below in the winter, that can really cut down on fuel use. And as we'll talk about a little later, fuel use and fuel collection, fuel combustion, and exposure to the consequences of that is one of the big risks in this region in general. So Pete wasn't consumed with despair to the point that he was just throwing up his hands. He was actively working with this organization, Ladakh Ecological Development Group, to build essentially a village, a new village that would house people who lost their homes in floods. And I think something like 1,500 houses just in Leh. It's not a huge city. That's like 40,000 people, 50,000 people were destroyed. And That's the outside of that same house. I think it was just made from mud brick, so they were trying to experiment with different materials choices, including these bricks, which are cement stabilized earth bricks, which are made in a ram press that was designed in South India, a place called Oroville. And it's designed to be operated by 2 people, and you can make a few hundred bricks a day if you're really working hard. And you can configure them in different ways, so you have these keys that can lock together with mortar. So that it provides a little more seismic resilience. And also, you can have molds that can take reinforcement, so like steel reinforcement.
How big are those, John?
Those are like this size. Yeah. Some of them are a little longer. So he was working with all those kinds of materials, and he and I that same day we got to tour one of these. These white structures were donated by some, I think the Indian Confederacy of Industry or something. So a lot of groups came in the wake of the floods, well-intentioned, and dumped a lot of aid in Ladakh, including these prefab structures. And we went inside one of them. I think they're made from like polycarbonate and like steel. Just a real disaster for this climate. And they trap condensation when people cook or even just exhaling. And not a real locally, culturally appropriate solution. And in fact, the installed cost of one of these was twice the cost of this model home, which employed local people. And now, if you go back to these areas, people use them mostly as storerooms. So, cautionary tale. So traditional house features in this area. This is a pretty standard traditional house. The ground floor is usually stone, and then the upper floors are mud brick, adobe. And these windows are pretty big, but back in the day, the windows would be even smaller than those on the far side. Just because they didn't have glass, they didn't, the bigger your window, the more heat that would escape, which had serious consequences in a place that gets this cold. And that's this high. So, slowly as the roads improved, Ladakhis would have access to glass and to other kinds of wood. Really, the local wood is really just poplar and willow, and it's pretty expensive because it's relatively scarce. So there are also some strategies that thermally made a lot of sense in these traditional houses. Thick walls, they could be up to a meter thick in some cases, which had some insulating value even though they didn't use insulation per se. And then on the ground floor, they would keep the animals. And they would have a winter kitchen in the center of that ground floor. So these are pretty big houses. Upstairs they'd have a summer kitchen, below they'd have a winter kitchen. And the winter kitchen was surrounded by stables and storerooms for fodder. So it was kind of a buffer strategy. And the families would spend that whole winter in that kitchen with a hole in the roof to let the smoke out from their hearth fire. And then you can see on the roof they store their fodder up there, and people really build up a store of animal dung, dried dung, fodder grasses, and wood, brushwood, to see them through the winter. Life is defined by the 7-month-long, 8-month-long winter up here. It's a short growing season, and kind of like I was driving down the road the other day, and I saw a lot of people splitting wood and getting their wood in. It's in August or even sooner. It's just a similar mentality. And these houses are built by their owners, traditionally. But nowadays, the owner-builder tradition is rapidly eroding. So this is in Leh. This is a new hotel going up in Leh. They have a nod to the traditional architecture in the form of the shinsak, which is this ornately carved, these lintel features, and otherwise it's a whole lot of concrete, stone, cement, plaster, and they're trying to take advantage of tourist boom in Ladakh, and the tourist numbers of the last decade have really skyrocketed. And the economy in Ladakh really comes down to tourism, agriculture, although less and less, and the army. There's a heavy army presence because all the borders are contested on the east with China and on the west with Pakistan. So there's 500,000 Indian army in Jammu and Kashmir. And if they left tomorrow, if peace broke out, and Ladakh would rapidly have to come up with some solutions because their economy might collapse. The new economy. So this is a pretty standard site walking around LA, as is this. This is a standard scene in a couple ways. One, the use of these reinforced concrete pillars. And then they'll infill with mud bricks because it's cheap, but they're not tied to the superstructure in any way. And then, they'll build stacks of these, and these are migrant laborers. So Ladakh, you could say, is relatively prosperous, compared to the per capita, average income in India. Ladakh earns 2 or 3 times that, and they can afford to hire workers from Nepal or Bihar, which is a very poor state in northern India, who are desperate for work. They come up in the summers and build, and they'll do agricultural work. But this owner-builder tradition is rapidly disappearing. And that tradition had an Amish barn raising component to it. It was, you would build your house and all your neighbors would come over and help you, and you'd return the favor. And there are still villages where that's practiced, but not many left. So, in thinking about resilience, just strictly in terms of a house and the materials you use to build that house and the techniques, it's instructive. This photo was taken by a good friend of mine, Sonam Mangchuk, who is he's a Renaissance man. He's an engineer and a designer and activist in Ladakh, and now he's become something of a rammed earth expert. And he did a little pilgrimage around the region and around the world, actually, looking at different rammed earth techniques, because he believes rammed earth is the solution in terms of how to build in this region to last, and how to build in a way that's that thermally makes sense, that's pleasing to the senses, and that is durable in the face of not just earthquakes, because this is a zone 5 high-risk earthquake zone, but in terms of accelerating risks posed by climate change. Which I'll talk about a little bit later. So this is a palace in the village of Lascaux, and it's at least 600 years old. And so Angshik went around and he documented, he was looking for which structures are still standing. And in every case, there's these rammed earth walls, over a meter thick, very dense, had the right, he'd take soil samples, they had the right proportion of, clay and sand. And that, if you asked him, he would say, rammed earth's the way to go, but he'll acknowledge that rammed earth is very expensive. It's very labor intensive. Those thermal advantages that you get from having those really thick walls that almost serve as a thermal battery in conjunction with the passive solar heating strategy will soak up that heat and give it off at night, or even over a period of days if you have cloudy days over the period of a week, which is rare here because they get 320 sunny days a year, but it happens. You'll still be warm. You don't need any other heating source if it's done right. But this is built by a king who probably had a lot of servants and maybe even slaves, and this is the result. But in this day and age, what is a homeowner to do if you don't have that kind of clout? In terms of, so I should get back to Pinamgil. So Pinamgil, to wrap up this first little story, a couple years later, he decided, I don't want to work with nonprofits anymore. I want to go into business for myself, which is a big risk. There's not a real culture of entrepreneurship in Ladakh. And so he was really going out on a limb. So he and 3 friends of his formed a company, and they decided they were going to build earthen solar buildings for clients in and around Leh. And that they would start, and that they wanted to do it really well, right? They wanted to demonstrate that this is quality construction, and they wanted to combat this idea in India, in a lot of parts of the developing world, that mud or earth is associated with poverty. So there's this word in Hindi, pukka, and pukka is used to, literally it means right or cooked. But in this context, in the context of your house, it means durable, it means solid, it means built to last, and it also means modern. It means you've arrived. And typically that means concrete, cement, plaster. So Pinamgal and Company, they want to demonstrate that earth can also be pukka. And in order to do that, they're starting with wealthy people. So their idea is, if we can get the elite or the opinion leaders in this community to get on board, that will go a long way to demonstrate that this material can have status associations. This material is something that people with a lot of disposable income want to pay extra for, because it's comfortable and they think it's beautiful, and for all the reasons that we invest heavily in our own homes. It's the same kind of matrix of decisions. And so here they are. This is last month. That's Pete and his trusty crew. And this is taken 2.5 years, which is roughly 1.5 years longer than anticipated, but it's the first one. And so they're hoping they can take the lessons from this first project and their very patient client, and pay it forward. This house is interesting, and this one, these are 2 different houses, but they're built for 2 brothers who both own businesses. An interesting tidbit about this, the second floor, when I was there last year, they were insulating, they made cavity walls upstairs. And you can kind of see they run conduit. So the electrical and plumbing is already set into the walls. And they set in shelving, and they really thought through a lot of details. So when it's done, it's really beautiful. But on the second floor, they insulated with pashmina wool, which there's a lot of waste pashmina wool from the government pashmina processing center that just kind of gets discarded. It's like the floor cutting into bark or something. And so they're like, we'll take that for 10 rupees a kilogram, which is like 25 cents. And so they're insulating this building with pashmina, which I get a kick out of. Okay, so this is the second little story. And this is my friend Ergin's house, Ergin Dorje. And this is in a place called the Zanskar Valley. Zanskar is, you could say it's part of Ladakh, but there have been times in history where it's been independent. But it's a pretty remote valley, right at the foot of the high Himalaya, south of Ladakh. And I was staying in this house in 2005, and I was staying in, you can't see it, but the room behind this room, this was their kitchen, and something very strange happened, something that had never really happened in Zanskar before, if you talk to local people, to hear them tell it. It rained for 4 or 5 days straight. Pretty, not like downpour, but pretty heavily, pretty steadily. And I was staying in their shrine room, because that was the only room available. And every night I watched progressively this hole get bigger and bigger. from the rain and water pouring down through the roof, because the roofs are made from, what they do is they put a poplar beam, like this beam, and then they'll have smaller beams running perpendicular, and then they'll cover those with willow sticks, which can be like this thick, and over that they'll put grasses, dried grasses, and then they'll pack maybe 4 or 5 inches of mud on top of that, and it's a heavy earthen roof. Works fine because it doesn't rain that much, but if it rains, if the weather starts changing, not a great system. So I woke up one night, rain is cascading onto my face, and I go in and wake up Bergen, and he says, "Oh, okay, no problem." And we wound up pitching a tent out in his yard. That greenhouse wasn't there before, and that's where I stayed for the next week or two. We went down to the market the next day, and we wanted to buy some tarps in the market in this town, Puddam, which is a smallish town, but it's the biggest town in Zanskar. And there were tarps, but the price had gone up 5-fold in a few days. Because everybody wanted a tarp. Because nobody had a house that was built to withstand that kind of weather. So Greg said, "Okay, we won't get a tarp, we'll stay in the tent." Which was fine. So he started building this house on an agricultural field. And that was a big no-no traditionally, because there's not that much arable land. I mean, there's plenty of land, but there's not that much water. So that really constrained the size of these villages and the size of the farmers' productive acreage. So you would never build on a productive agricultural field back in the day, but now various imperatives have overcome that reluctance. And so we started building a house here, and this is what novelists would call foreshadowing. This stovepipe in the foreground. I'll come back. So this idea of pukka, Ergen built with, he used a mix of concrete blocks in the corners, kind of finger joint interlaced in the corners, and then mud bricks, and stone. He used kind of a hybrid. But a lot of people in Zanskar are now building more and more with stone, cement, and the concrete pillar kind of construction, which if you do it right is really good in terms of the seismic risk. If it's properly reinforced, everything's tied together, then it's great, but not everyone does it right. And it wouldn't be hard to imagine a lot of bricks and stones flying every which way, even in a moderate earthquake. But there's this, so this is a company that makes cement in India, and there are a lot of these companies, and they have great advertisements. I love looking at the billboards and the TV ads, because they're all about, there's always just like big macho man, and kind of a lot of innuendos around, our cement is so hard, and this is what you're up against. This is the idea of cement, concrete equals pukka. Practically, you want your house to stand up in the monsoon. If you lived in Uttar Pradesh and you live in I've been in some of these villages, these mud wall, thatch roof, they need to get not rebuilt, but extensively repaired after every monsoon. So this is looking pretty good, and if you have enough income, not only does this keep the rain out, and if there's an earthquake, keep a roof over your head, but it signals to your neighbors that you've arrived. So it's performing multiple functions for you. So in Zanskar, and this is the central Zanskar Valley in winter, this change is happening here too. You could say this is one of the most remote parts of India, at the bitter end of every supply chain. Whether you're importing, bags of cement, most people buy it on the black market now, but steel, glass, propane gas, packaged foods, noodle soups, whatever. It has to be trucked over several Himalayan passes in diesel trucks. If the road's open, the road's closed 8 months a year, and even in the summer, it can get washed out, or strikes can cause there to be. You go in the market, and having built a few structures in Zanskar over the years, it can be challenging. You can't just run to the lumberyard and expect to get what you want. You go and they're like, oh yeah, come back in 2 weeks. You know, that's when we'll have our next shipment. Despite all those hurdles, that pukka mentality is maybe even stronger than a lot of places in Zanskar. Maybe because of their remoteness and the yearning to be maybe a little closer to the mainstream. And then pile on top of that, you know, there are a lot of demographic shifts. Young people go out of the valley for education. If you get a government job, great, you can stay in Zanskar, but otherwise there's not a whole lot going on unless you want to keep farming like your parents. But people have been educated to think, why did I just go through all this schooling if I'm going to go back and do exactly what my parents did? So a lot of my younger friends aren't exactly excited about getting dirt under their fingernails. So all of the changes, the climate changes, are happening against the background of these economic, cultural, demographic dislocation. The problem, again, we're still on the idea of what's a durable house. The problem with the focus on pukka is this is a really cold place. It's even colder than other parts of Ladakh. And you get a lot of snow. And this prioritizing, which you can understand, of mud brick, mud plaster buildings. Traditionally, dust would rain down from the ceiling. And, they're hard to keep clean. So people think, if I had a stone building that's cement plastered, it'll last longer and cost me less money over the long run to repair it, and it'll be easier to keep clean. But it's cold, and people are starting to learn in the last decade that those maybe aren't the best solution, to go whole hog in that direction, because these cement plastered stone buildings really don't breathe. So condensation collects on the walls, they get really damp inside the kitchen, and they're cold. And so this idea of stanches, which means to show in the local language, but like to put a good face forward. I see the pendulums shifting a little bit back from people worrying about, how's it going to look to my neighbors? They're like, actually I'm really cold in this new house I built. So maybe I need to rethink this. This is a map of climate risk vulnerability. And so putting together a lot of different types of risks, of drought and flood, and food system vulnerability. And Zanskar's up here in the dark spot. In Zanskar 6-7 years ago, they had locusts. No one had ever heard of that before. 2 years the locusts stayed and ate everything. All the crops, all the fodder crops, all the barley that people grow for their own consumption, and tea. That's strange. And friends have told me that there had been this move to get away from storing barley, which is their real staple crop and kind of the anchor of their cultural identity. And they can keep barley for 30 years once they roast it and grind it with these awesome water-powered mills called runtucks. But people have gotten away from that, especially the younger people. Like, what do I need barley stored for? Why do I need a whole room full of barley? Because I can go down and have a ration card, and because they're a scheduled tribe, according to India's bureaucracy, they're a border minority. They're subsidized. They get subsidized rations of kerosene, sugar, flour, and rice, which has been great in terms of providing us a safety net, because if you have a bad harvest, you're not going to starve, but it's really undermined the traditional agriculture. So after the locusts came, a lot of people, half their diet, they still grow for themselves. Even the people who work for the government and have an income and shop in the market for a lot of their meals. So people are like, maybe I should store some barley. So locusts are just one of the risks. They're extremes of temperature. I've noticed even in the short time I've been going, it's hotter in the summer. Winters, late winters warmer. Spring arrives earlier. And if you talk to the old people, this is very apparent. They're just like, this, you know, this is very different. It doesn't snow as much. Zanskar, they tell stories of by April, snow would be piled 8 feet high, and they'd have to cut tunnels to go visit their neighbors. And you'd be walking over to visit your neighbor, and you come around the corner, there's a wolf there, because the wolf fell in the tunnel and couldn't jump out because the snow was so high. Should also suggest to you that Zanskars are really badass people. Problem with wolves. So, things are changing fast in this region. And in fact, to throw some numbers at you, I think in the last century, the average temperature in the Himalayan region has gone up by 1.6 degrees Celsius, which is more than twice the rate of warming of the global average. So this place is warming almost faster than any other part of the globe, except the high Arctic. And I'll come back to it too. And as I mentioned, the only reason people can survive here really is, yes, there's snow melt and there's ice melt from the glaciers. And that's the only reason they have water to grow food or to do anything. To make mud bricks, you need water to make mud bricks. The other really core reason is these a reciprocal labor arrangement. So every household is part of a group of households. And they plow together, they plant together in the spring, they harvest together. They chew tangches, which means giving water, they irrigate together. So they have an allotment of water, and they get to figure out amongst their household grouping how much you get to use over a 24-hour period every week. So they help each other. So these are women going to the fields to probably to weed. It's midsummer, or irrigate. If they have shovels, they're irrigating. But without that, you know, it just doesn't work, really, because the capital is shared, the working capital, the draft animals, right? Some people may not have, there are these animals called zo, they're yak cow hybrids, and they're almost designed for draft power. They're the ideal, they're like a tractor, four-legged tractor. Well, one house may not have a zo, so you borrow the other house's zo. But that house may not have, you know, their own runtock, so you use my runtock to grind your barley. So that is how the system works. But again, going back to those demographic and economic shifts, the ration system has really pulled the rug out from under this system. It just doesn't make time as money now. So if I'm going to give my time to my neighbor, that's a concrete loss for me in terms of time I'm not spending in the market running my little shop or being a pony man for trekkers in summer. So those forces, those economic forces are almost as overwhelming and rapid and sobering as the environmental and climate changes. So that is a real source of vulnerability when we're thinking about resilience. And at this point, I'm starting to think more about resilience at the village scale. Well, soon. So there's another vulnerability, and that is these are hearths in some of these houses, and they're pretty smoky, and they always have been. And they're less so today because more people are using propane, which is subsidized for cooking in the summer, but in the winter, which is 8 months, they still burn yak dung, sheep dung. There's not a lot of wood up there. Because they need to heat their homes. So they cook and heat with this fuel on pretty simple stoves, and it creates for a really dangerous environment just in terms of the combustion products. So particulates, carbon monoxide, and all sorts of nasty stuff. So this probably doesn't fall under most people's definition of a resilient building, but if we're thinking about risk and we're thinking about people's vulnerability, this is topmost on my list because this is every day killing people, and not just in Zanskar, but 3 billion people around the world still cook with solid fuels in relatively simple stoves or open fires. It's almost half the world's population. And that kills 3.5 million people every year. So people have been talking a lot, with good reason, about the Ebola outbreak, which I think the latest count I heard was 1,200 confirmed. That's since March, maybe. Exposure to this stuff, just in kitchens, just household air pollution, kills 11,000 people every day. So I would call that an epidemic. And if we're thinking about resilience in terms of, increasing the resilience of families and communities, I think that deserves to be considered, especially if you're thinking about how to design a house. These are just more scenes from Zanskar, and women mostly spend hours every week collecting fuel. So in Zanskar, it's a pretty safe place that doesn't expose them to a lot of risks, but it's a time loss. It's a loss of productive time that they could spend on education or income-generating activities, or just resting. But in a lot of parts of the world, like parts of East Africa, it is a very dangerous thing going to collect this fuel, wood or dung. It exposes you to attack and in a lot of conflict-ridden areas. Same thing, just cooking for your family or heating your home. So this brings me to my last little story. So this is a village called Kumik in Zanskar. It's probably the oldest village in Zanskar. I mean, it's hard to know. There aren't very good records of these sorts of things, but people in Zanskar say Kumik's one of the original villages, which makes it at least 1,000 years old. And here you see, I don't know what that is, if that's alfalfa or what, but post-harvest. Kumik I like to describe, as you can see, it's, if you've been to Taos Pueblo, it's kind of that stacked, keep everything concentrated, keep the agricultural land, free and productive, don't build on that. So they're up on this rocky spur, a moraine left by a long vanished glacier. And Kumik is experiencing, two core kinds of impacts. In terms of climate change, they're on the front lines because their glaciers melting. So up on the mountain above the village, there's been a real pronounced trend of glacier retreat, and also they had permanent snowfields that have just crept year after year up the mountainside, and that's the source of all of their water. And so Kumik the last few decades, especially the last 2 decades, has really been in a severe drought. So almost every other year they run out of water before the harvest in August, and they lose crops. They have to fallow fields in the spring, kind of shrinking. And the other impact is what I just showed you a few slides ago. Kumik's infant mortality rate really hasn't improved in the last 30 years, even though the roads come to Zanskar, healthcare is better, there's a hospital in Potom, people understand the need for better hygiene, they have propane gas to cook with for part of the year. It's stayed the same, more or less. It's improved a little bit. And the healthcare workers I talk to think a lot of it has to do with exposure to the smoke from just trying to stay warm in the winter. So Kumik, there you see the stream. There's just one stream that irrigates all of Kumik and provides all the water for other uses, and it's, you can see it dry there. I was there a month or two ago, same story. There's one of the holding ponds up above the village. Dry. So, the way I found out about Kumek, in 2008 I was there working with some organizations on passive solar design. And a friend of mine, Ergen, the guy whose house I showed you before, introduced me to this other gentleman, Stobden. And he sought me out because he told me he was building a new house. And since that's kind of unusual, because usually you inherit the parents' house down through the ages, I was like, why are you building a new house? He said, well, we have a drought in my village, so we're all leaving, and we're going to build a new village from scratch, and I want my house to be passive solar heated. Because he had heard about some of this. Actually, he had gotten his hands on a CD or DVD where the mentor P. Namgyal, the guy I mentioned earlier, son of Mangchuk, had kind of tried to promote passive solar heating as a smart solution to the fact that it's really cold, we have a lot of sunshine, and fuel's really expensive to truck over the Himalayas. So Stobden's like, that sounds great. And he invited me to come see where he was building, and this was in 2008 his foundation. And he gave me a tour of the new village site. And there he is, there's Stobden. And this is the new village site. It's in a place called Martang. And Martang was kind of a no man's land. People graze their animals down there, but there wasn't a lot to graze on because Martang means red place, which made a lot of sense to me because when I saw it, I was like, these guys are colonizing Mars. It's very windy, it's very dry, it's very hot, not a lot grows down there, there's no water. And I was like, well, how did you choose this place? And he's like, well, it's the only option, really. But there was another reason. They knew that they could dig a canal and bring water from the river, which they figured for at least the next several decades there'd still be water in the river, if not in the stream, in their old village, because the river drains many, many glaciers and snowfields and mountains, which seems like a good bet. So they spent years digging a canal. The villagers, and they started doing it by themselves. Later, the government pitched in a bit, but they just kind of went for it. And drawing on those communal labor traditions that were still intact in this village. There's a couple. There's a foundation, stone foundation. There's a mud brick house. So. New Kumek, doesn't it look great? But their belief is that with water, all things are possible. And so slowly, if you plant saplings, and there's a windbreak and for shade, and then people started to plant barley fields and wheat and peas that they'll plow back into the soil. Peas will fix some nitrogen. Slowly, they're obsessed with making it green, right? They're like, you come back in 10 years, it'll be green. Which is so hard to believe the first day I went there, but it's happening, even in the last 5 years. So, they asked me to help out, and to make a long story short, and it's a long enough story that I wrote a book about it. People tell me I need to practice shamelessly plugging this. Because in this day and age, that's the only way you can sell books. There's my book. It's you can pre-order it on Amazon. If you want. Okay. So they wrote me in. What's that?
When's the book coming out?
It comes out in March.
Okay.
I probably have to join Twitter before that. I'm not excited about that, but. So they wrote me into helping out with this small project. We would build a community hall and prayer hall called a Ladakh. And this would be kind of the focal point in the new village, and we would make it passive solar heated. And I thought, great, and maybe I will also include some other things that I think maybe you should be exposed to and consider while you're building your own homes. Because a lot of people are building their own homes in this new village site. And so we just got to it. This is summer 2008. We did a little bit of money. No, this is 2011, I'm sorry. We started with foundation, then everyone pitching in, fire brigade style. You know, we put some sawdust in there, kind of our half-hearted attempt to insulate it, but sawdust was hard to find. And slowly, walls went up. So the thumbnail sketch of this is we, instead of doing concrete pillars, we did kind of a cheaper version of that. We made these special concrete blocks that had a hole in them that could take a piece of rebar, which is plenty. And we kind of stacked those up the corners, and then we, maybe I have a picture later that shows you we ultimately did a ring beam, a reinforced concrete ring beam. So everything's tied together. And we used concrete blocks between the large solar windows. And we did a cavity wall approach. So the idea here was there's mud brick here, and mud brick here is a foot thick, and we stuffed that full of whatever we could find, straw, sawdust. I was back there in July because we had to finish. It had settled and we had to fix the roof and put more insulation in. So local insulation and provide a thermal break for the main room. And then we put some through stones to tie the walls together, mortar them in place. And you know, slowly, the walls went out. We used a fair amount of cement and concrete because, you know, in moderation it's a good thing. It does increase resilience, especially when you think about earthquakes. And there it was by towards the end of that first summer. Simple little building. We got some beams trucked in from Kashmir because they're so expensive because they're so scarce in Zanskar. And man, this guy showed a hard bargain. But so we bought our roof beams and put those on. And along the way we had a lot of fun. So it was, you know, people in Kumit, you can tell there's a low-grade stress there. Zanskaris are famous for being like cheerfully stoic and resilient, and I'll comment on what I think are the psychological roots of that, and environmental roots of that resilience. But you know, it's pretty stressful if, you know, your village is the one village known as the waterless village, and they're the canary in the coal mine. You know, other Zanskaris you talk to, they're like, yeah, it's probably coming for us too, but not yet, so I'm not going to worry about it. But despite that, we had a good time. We swapped hats from time to time. We drank a lot of butter tea together. We made a lot of mud bricks. So each household contributed 10 days of labor, which for some households is a real tough thing to do. Some are smaller households, they don't have another source of income. Some households have big families and 3 sons with government jobs. It's not a big deal, but everyone pitched in. It's like summer camp in a way. It was like, you know, we signed each other's yearbooks on the last day. And then Ishe Paldan, this guy, who's the oldest man in the village, there he is, wears his goncha every day, his woolen robe. He and I spent a day cutting this canal to bring water to mix mud bricks, because you need water for a lot of reasons, but if you want to make mortar and concrete blocks and mud bricks, you need water for that too. And yeah, so we just, we kept building, and there's lots of singing and joking along the way, and I don't know, I think this is a scene that, except for the background, maybe, you can see Yestermorrow, right, in natural building classes. Probably you wouldn't see the two-person shovel technique. I think we should introduce that here, because it really works. You can just shovel longer with the rope. And houses, all the while, houses were going up around us these last few years. And I was gratified to see, and it wasn't just the example of this community hall. A lot of conversations, a lot of me like buttonholing people and like, so have you thought about passive solar? And we would go and we would orient the house, and it's a little harder to get. It's easier to get people to buy into that because the traditional houses, a lot of them face south, and it's common sense. Like, let's put a lot of surface area to the south. We'll at least soak up some of that energy. And you see these thick black bands around the windows and dark surfaces. People know dark surfaces are warmer to the touch and turn light to heat. But it's a harder sell, insulation. You don't see it. It's like, really, do I really need to spend extra to insulate? And it's far more important than solar collection. Look at the passive house movement here. It's the passive house movement hasn't taken off in Zanskar yet, but we'll keep trying. But yeah, people use a mix of materials. So they use mud bricks. On the second floor of this house will all be mud bricks. And here's kind of a solar heated corridor kind of communal space. And this direct gain is probably not going to do a lot to heat that room, but every little bit helps in terms of fuel you don't have to burn to stay warm. And then cement plaster, I'm okay with that, right? It's like, why not? But the internal surfaces, I think people are realizing more and more, based on conversations I've had, even just in Kumek, that some people are going back to earthen plaster because they think it's more comfortable. So, just to wrap up, when I think about resilience in this part of the world, it's a question of system boundaries. And if you draw your system boundary around a house, you want to ask questions like, what materials should I use? How can I design in a way that some people still want to have their animals in the house, some want them separate. Stoll did once, he's in his new house, he's got animals in the house because he likes having that tradition, but he also thinks they add heat on the north side. He puts them on the north side of the house. And then, how much concrete to use and what's the expense of that. Hovering over all of this is the affordability question. Because by the time it reaches Zanskar, everything's 4 times as expensive. But we also need to think about system boundaries at the village scale. And when we're thinking about that, you can't look at a single building. You've got to ask questions like, where does the water come from? Where does the cooking energy come from? Again, back to that annoying question that I keep asking my friends, 50 years from now, will the new village be viable? Will water still be coming in that canal from the river? Or will the river level drop? Already every year they have to maintain that canal at considerable expense because soil caves in or, it's just entropy. It's like things need upkeep, especially here in this extreme environment. So you really need to start zooming out. Even at the level of the house, like, where are the energy and water and the barley that will fill the barley stores, which in a traditional house is almost half of the house. Where's that coming from? Is that still viable? What sustains the family that builds and owns the house? Kumek, they think about this a lot, just because they've had to abandon their old village and really think long and hard about what they want in the new village. And hovering over all that is water, right? So, everyone keeps telling me, if you don't have water, you got nothing, right? We're fortunate here. They would come here and faint with delight. It's so green and there's so much water. And that's what they struggle to get every day. And then in terms of the third system boundary is the region. So if we zoom out even further, this is a satellite image of what's called the atmospheric brown cloud that sits over northern India for part of every year and disperses. And this is the Bay of Bengal, and Bangladesh is here, and it's Nepal, and up here is Ladakh and Zanskar, and Bhutan and Tibet. And you can see, even though it's two-dimensional, you can almost see how this cloud, this brown cloud, laps at the feet of the Himalaya and the Tibetan plateau. And a lot of what's in this cloud is soot, and some dust, and some other particles, organic carbon and sulfates. But a lot of it is from combustion, inefficient combustion. From other places, from the Middle East or from China, weather patterns kind of stir it all together, but a lot of it's homegrown. From cooking and heating fires, from small industry like brick kilns, from diesel trucks and transport and generators to keep the lights on because the power's always going out in North India. And from open burning. So wildfires, but much more than that, at least in this region, and burning of agricultural waste to get rid of it. And if you want to understand what's going on in a place like Kumik, I argue you need to understand what's happening at this system boundary, because it all flows back to that little dry stream. Why are they moving? They're moving because they've run out of water. Why have they run out of water? Well, their glaciers receding and their snow fields are disappearing because it's not snowing as much. And even if it does snow, spring arrives earlier and earlier. Winters are warmer. This stuff has a lot to do with that. It adds a lot of energy to the atmosphere, and it does it close to home. So in a way, where CO2 is globally mixed and stays in the atmosphere for 100 years on average, a molecule of CO2, this stuff doesn't travel that far because its lifespan in the atmosphere is only about a week, and then it will settle out, it'll get washed out. But while it's up there, it is very potent. Imagine a little black rock suspended in the air, absorbing sunlight, radiating it back as heat in the atmosphere, but also if it settles out on a glacier, it's like, turning a hairdryer on the surface of a glacier for as long as it's exposed. If it gets buried by snowfall, then no problem. But, so you can kind of see this, and there's pretty overwhelming evidence that the 54,000 glaciers of the Himalayan Tibetan Plateau are in a general state of retreat. And every new study confirms that. And so, Kumik sadly will not be the last such story. So if we're thinking about resilience, if we're getting back to my annoying question, 50 years from now, what's life like in Bhutan, or parts of Tibet, or southwest China, or downstream in the plains of India, where the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Indus, these are glacier-fed rivers. And then this is a map of drought risk globally from climate change. And you see it's mostly sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. This is flood risk. And another thing I haven't mentioned yet, but these glacial lake outburst floods, as glaciers melt, they turn to water, and these waters get dammed up behind moraines, which is that kind of pile of debris that a glacier leaves when it retreats. And those moraines will collapse if they're under too much pressure. And everything downstream is in the path of that water. And this happened in Zanskar a few years ago when I was there, a small one. No one was hurt, but everyone's like, wow, never heard of that before. That had never happened in anyone's living memory. So this is a real risk, especially when we're thinking about siting houses or communities even, as people get displaced. Well, what's upstream? And so, so just to conclude, I would argue, I'm not going to throw a lot of answers or solutions your way, but just in terms of framing the question, resilience, we really need to be thinking at those three scales. and beyond the regional scale globally. And I would argue that, you know, there's this cliche, you know, in energy and climate policy circles, there are no silver bullets, there's only silver buckshot. And it gets way overused, but, you know, if there is a silver bullet, I would argue this represents the silver bullet, right? When we're thinking about resilience at any scale. That canal was dug the first few years by hand by a group of 50-some households with pickaxes and shovels. Their backs were against the wall. They did it out of necessity. But I've been party to some of these communal efforts. They had a good time while they were doing it too. That is what resilience looks like. That is lunchtime on the job site, our little building. You know, while we're making mud bricks, sharing barley flour and butter tea and various goodies. You know, that is the secret sauce. You know, it's really going to take, well, I like to think of it as kind of a pincer movement that's going to be required, and what I mean by that is at the grassroots scale, a whole lot of education. So the impacts have arrived. You can see that in a place like Kunik, but many other places too in the region. So people need to start adapting. That doesn't mean we stop mitigating the risk in the future, but the beautiful thing is what this guy is doing in a village west of Zanskar and Cargill. He's doing both, right? He's teaching local homeowners how to be part of the grander mitigation effort, because, you know, if they embrace certain of these energy efficient techniques, they'll burn less fuel, and they'll produce both less of that soot that you see flapping at the feet of the mountains, and carbon dioxide, among other things, methane too. And at the same time, they'll be adapting to the changes that have already arrived and which are coming fast and furious. And at the micro scale, this is a pollster in Nepal, northern Nepal, in the Ladakh Valley. I saw people waging war against household air pollution, one house at a time, you know, one mother at a time, explaining just exactly why you get those headaches and why, you know, 'cause some people know, they're like, yeah, I get it, I'm breathing smoke all day, but I don't have a choice, right? We have to eat. But if you pair that message with, well, here are some alternatives, here are some solutions, you know, you can make a dent in that problem in a big way. And you can do it in southwest China. This is a house in Yunnan province. All that wood is just for cooking, even though they have electric rice cookers and they've got biogas plants. They still cook like this a lot of their meals. They like the way it tastes, you know. They're used to cooking over a fire. And this place is a beautiful house, but there's so much soot in that kitchen. Or this house, Mendo Tamang's house in Nepal, where she's got a new stove hood that an NGO gave her, but there's still unacceptably high levels of particles in that kitchen from that fire. Or this kitchen in Langtang, it's a mud hearth, wood fired, and right at the foot of a rapidly retreating glacier. And this woman, I hung out with her for a while, and you know, I was like, do you ever get tired of breathing the smoke from that? She looked at me, she's like, what are you, an idiot? Like, yeah, of course. Did you have an alternative? You know, we have to eat. Or this village in Uttar Pradesh, which is down in the plains of India, where they cook in a similar stove of mud chula. Kind of out in the courtyard, but they're still exposed to levels of particulate pollution that are 40 times the World Health Organization recommended threshold. But there are other sources of this stuff. These are some kids playing while they burn rice straw in Bhutan. A big source of that cloud we saw in the satellite image. And this is a brick kiln in Kathmandu, pile of coal, pile of bricks. And, but there are solutions even to these seemingly unrelated issues that have to do with building too. And my friend Angchuk, who I mentioned earlier, he would like to tackle both of these problems. He's trying to start an initiative where he gathers waste straw from Punjab, where there's a lot of rice farming, and they just burn it every fall, all this straw. If you drive through there, it's crazy. There's so much smog. And he wants to take that straw and make straw clay panels that would displace these bricks in a lot of places. And that would incidentally lead to lower mass roofs, lower risk in the event of an earthquake, more insulating value, and on and on and on, and all sorts of other co-benefits to solve this problem. And this gets back to the pincer movement. So at the grassroots level, at the kind of macro level, policy, decision maker, political leader level, there's the need for education too about this and how this works and what the threats are associated with this pollution, which is coming from hearths, a lot of it, or from processes that have to do with people's desire to live pukka lives. And I'll just close by saying that conveniently, I think a lot of this stuff connects back at the hearth level, right? At all three system boundaries. Both the risks, the problems, and the solutions to making more resilient households, communities, if you want to go there, nation states. And places like Sekmol, which is a non-profit in Ladakh, they get this. It's a solar cooker that they use to cook a lot of their meals, and here's someone's drawn a nice little mural. Over here, here's like the polluting, Bokhari and some fossil fuels, kerosene stoves. But, you can use solar dryers and solar cookers, or even just cleaner burning stoves that aren't solar cookers. So, I'll just leave it at that, and I'll say I think it's a grand design problem at kind of interlocking scales, and they're all connected, and they all can start and finish at the hearth scale, and that is the idea behind our little community building project. This building could be like a hearth for this new village, but it's solar heated, and that part isn't even as important as the fact that it's insulated and hopefully safe and comfortable when it's finished. Yestermorrow gets this too. So this is Norgay, and Norgay was here 2 years ago from Ladakh, a good friend of mine who works with P. Namgyal now. And he came for the natural building certificate and took a lot of what he learned back to Ladakh. And he and P. Namgyal started this company, and I know you can't read this, but it doesn't matter. So they started a business called Third Pole Enterprises. So they're starting with that one rammed earth house I showed you earlier, which is that one, maybe? But they have a couple other projects going on now. They're doing really nice, high quality rammed earth, solar heated. But they call it Third Pole because they want to take it to Nepal and Afghanistan and Tibet and other parts of India and everywhere where this type of building might make sense. And maybe they'll learn that in some places, although there's a tradition of rammed earth in Bhutan and Tibet and Afghanistan and a lot of these places, maybe it's too expensive, and so maybe you do cement stabilized earth bricks, maybe you do something different that they haven't even thought of yet. Maybe they use these straw clay panels, but they're trying, right? And at this point, Angchuk emailed me this morning, and I mentioned I was giving this talk, and he's like, oh, okay, you need to advertise. You need Yestermorrow people to come to Ladakh and have fun they're having a natural building jamboree next summer. Or they'll do stuff like this on this campus, which is all solar heated, and make you feel good. And so we'll spread the word about that. So the last thing I would say about resilience is that I've learned a lot about it from this guy, Stolpen, who's one of the leaders of this village, Kumik, that's being abandoned and reinvented. And here it is in his new barley field in Martang, and he's going to plow that back in. And he's worked really hard to bring water to his property there, and he's a real cheerleader. He's like, we gotta just go for it. We can't keep looking back. We gotta look forward. And the thing I've learned from Stolpen is that despair is the enemy. So if you want to really get zoom out about this idea of resilience, that is the enemy. That is what you're fighting. So when you think about climate change, it seems so overwhelming, or even just the economic changes in this guy's valley. That's the enemy, and feeling alone. And he's got his neighbors even in this new. That's the old village up there in the corner, but it's starting to shift the center of gravity, and he's had a lot to do with that. And so what I've learned from these guys is kind of how to whistle while you work. And this is what Stolpen wrote on the door of his new house one day. Success is the ability to go from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm. I don't know if I agree with that definition, but I appreciate the sentiment. Keep plugging away, even if the odds seem overwhelming. The game is stacked against you. And I'll just circle back to P. Namgyal, whose story I started this with. And I saw P. Namgyal last month, and he got married, so maybe he will birth a child.